I'm concerned about our officers' ability to protect themselves.
With a critical shortage of police officers inside the NOPD, Mayor Cantrell is calling it a crisis. Many have called it a crisis for some time. Last week, she said she and NOPD Superintendent Sean Ferguson gave an update on the crime here in New Orleans, and the numbers show there's been little to no improvement. Many say it has a lot to do with burnout and low morale in the NOPD. We're getting some insight on some of the problems with the police department and crime here in the city with Loyola professor Ronald Surpass, who used to be the police superintendent. And Ronald, thank you for joining us. First of all, there's so much talk about this being a systemic problem in New Orleans. I think we all know that. I think the most concerning thing right now is to try and stop the bleeding so we can work on the systemic problems down the line.
Yeah, there are systemic problems, Eric. It's good to be with you again, especially at 8 o'clock hour instead of the 5 o'clock hour. And the Eagles is the greatest concert band that's ever been in existence as far as I'm concerned. I've seen them twice live here in New Orleans. This police department can only operate with what the council gives it based on the mayor's budget. The police department's been defunded since 2011 as it relates to staffing and retention. These moments of crisis that are being talked about now have been predicted by the votes of council members from 2011 till today. Stopping the retention issue or helping the retention issue speaks a lot to how the officers are talking about the department among themselves and their friends. And right now, that's not a good story. Finally, crime is absolutely out of control, but it's not been a crisis since last week. It's been a crisis since 2019.
And this kind of started, in your opinion, during the Landrieu years. There were problems. That's one of the reasons you left the department.
We had great successes, but we could never get the ball over the goal line about staffing and recruitment and retention. The police department was about 1,600 people when I returned in 2010, and today it's under 900, and the effective number is probably around 750 or 800. Remember, the council passes a budget proposed by the mayor, and the police chief's responsible to execute the council's budget approved as a policy statement of the city. Look at who's been on the council since 2010, and look who's been on the council since 2008, and ask them, did you perceive that this was going to be an issue as you kept voting for these budgets?
And what do you see as the answer right now? I mean, is it just a money problem? I mean, the morale within the NOPD is probably at an all-time low, I think.
Well, I think there's a serious question to be asked, and that is, I don't believe a consent decree or the Public Integrity Bureau can stop cops from being cops, but we're hearing a lot about it. And I think we probably need to pay a lot of attention to that. It's the execution of the plan is where things can become problematic. Recruitment and retention is based on how the cops are talking about the department. We got to change that.
Now, when you were in the NOPD back in the 90s, in the mid-90s, when Mark Morial was elected mayor, I mean, the murder rate got way above 400. They brought in Chief Pennington. You were right under the chief. What did you guys do to try and bring that rate down from, what, like 450 to 200 something?
Science and experience tells us to reduce crime, you have to be proactive and not respond to the radio, which is reactive. We did a lot of proactive work, and I got to tell you something. I respect Chief Pennington. He was a dear personal and professional friend, but you got to give the credit here to Mayor Morial. He led the charge every day. He got the financial support for Pennington and our plan. He got the support for the police department. He got the political support, the community support. You never had to wonder where Mayor Morial was, and he never walked out one day and said, oh my goodness, this is a crisis. He dealt with it every day.
Well, and it was a crisis back then. I mean, and I remember when Chief Pennington came in, he brought in a team, and as you said, he used science and you know, a good police force to knock down that crime rate.
There's no question we were successful with the strategies that we put into place. And I will say this to you, Eric, in all honesty, when I came back in 2010, the police department was in worse shape than it was in the mid-90s. And that's because of the lingering effect of Katrina. We got over that. In 2014, we were on the path to 2/3 of citizens approving of the police department. Police officers are not the issue that are driving citizens to such fear and despair. It's the political process that has defunded this police department since 2011. That's a fact. It's in the record. It's easy to substantiate.
And I mean, when Mayor Landrieu brought you back, he called you the Drew Brees of police chiefs. It was hard to live up to that. And then the problem that you ran into is, again, you thought that there was not the support from the mayor's office or the city council for the NOPD.
There's no question that we could not win the battle over staffing. And without staffing, you can't be proactive, you can't reduce crime, you can't respond to the citizens. Secondly, the police department's being asked to do too much, and this is all over the country. And that's a policy decision made by a mayor and a council to have the police respond to upwards of 50% of the calls, Eric, that have nothing to do with police work. If the liberal progressives want to reduce the footprint of police officers in people's lives, quit sending them to all these calls that have nothing to do with crime.
And there is a thought on the table by some members of the council to try and get civilians in there to do some of these jobs that do not have to be handled by a trained police officer.
Chief Pennington asked for that. Chief O'Reilly asked for that. Chief Compass asked for that. I asked for that. The record's clear that all of us have asked for that. But those costs are there, and the council decided not to fund the civilian costs necessary. I asked for 73 civilians. The council wouldn't be able to fund it. It was their decision. That's their choice.
And I mean, it is the #1 problem right now in the city. And how do you stop the bleeding immediately to get to those, as we were talking about earlier, those systemic problems?
I think we have to have it's a great question, Eric. We study this around the country in my academic life. And one of the top 5 things that drive police officers to such despair in their service is a lack of political continuity of leadership. In other words, whatever the flavor of the day is for certain politicians drives a wedge between what they're expecting of these men and women to do versus what they feel they're supported to do. I mean, it's clear. This is what we got to get a handle on. You got to lead from the front, not from where the crowd's going. And I think we're going to hopefully see that soon. Business communities, citizens community groups are coming together in unheralded ways again, once again. Did it in the 90s, did it after Katrina, did it in 2010. Let's hope we can get something done. Grandparents and parents need to be able to watch their children play on the street corner with safety, and we're not seeing that.
And there have been calls by some for the mayor to get rid of Sean Ferguson. Is that the problem?
That's an easy political solution. Let me tell you what Sean's facing. Every day they're adding more water to a sinking boat. It's hard to steer the boat when you're trying to get water out of it all day long, and that's what Sean's dealing with. You can only play the game that you're given, right? I mean, if you got 11 players playing against you, you've only got 5. It's very difficult to be proactive and effective. And I take my hat off to Sean. He's fighting a tough fight, and the men and women are more importantly fighting the toughest fight.
And you know, we've seen some of these brazen crimes in the street. We saw that off-duty New Orleans police officer the other night getting beat up by a crowd of young people.
You know, Eric, it's important to remember that as much as the police study criminal behavior, criminals study police behavior. And if they sense and if they get a feeling that there's not as many cops and they're not able to be proactive and look for the robbers and the murderers and the rapists, they talk among one another and it becomes more brazen. That's my 40-year experience. And I'm telling you, that's the way it goes down.
And I'm assuming you heard from Councilman Oliver Thomas, who was saying, hey, let's bring in the National Guard. Let's get more boots on the ground.
I respect OT, but that's obfuscation. The National Guard cannot introduce itself into civilian law enforcement. It's against the law. So it's a bit of obfuscation. I think OT was great, man. In the 90s, he was a wonderful council person to work with. I think he might be the only one on the council that really gets what it takes to turn around crime in the city of New Orleans, and I hope he can be very successful.
Okay, now that was a pretty strong statement you just made.
Obfuscation? The National Guard
that he's the only council person, in your opinion, right now, who understands what to do.
No question. In the case of JP, let's see what happens. He's not been on the council long. Oliver was there when we did this in the 90s, and much of those practices have been scientifically proven to be sound. We need to do them again. Moreno's been there a long time. Haven't seen anything new or interesting from there, and the rest of the council are new. We got to see what they're going to do.
And would you call this more of a political problem, a police problem, or all the above?
It starts as a political problem because that's where the decisions are made on what the police are going to respond to and what's going to be funded. It's a community problem because people are not safe. They don't feel safe. Businesses are not safe. Schools are not safe. and police officers feel devalued and villainized here in the city of New Orleans. Just look what the Audubon Park did to them a couple of years ago, the Audubon Zoo. I mean, how reprehensible was that? So the men and women need to know that the political leadership stands on their side, not for abuse, not for unconstitutional policing, but to go out there and get things done. And when you see the department bleed out on recruitment and bleed out on retention, it doesn't send a positive message to the men and women who stay.
And quickly, there have been some people saying that maybe we should change the charter, have an elected chief who is answerable to the people and not an appointed chief who is answerable to the mayor.
To be honest with you, I never supported that, but I do now.
Really?
I'm telling you, Eric, I never supported that before because the mayor is the boss of the city and you're part of that team, and I understood that, but 3 mayors and a governor. But in New Orleans today, I think the police chief, like many cities in Louisiana, could be elected, should be elected, and let that person go out there and fight for these issues, not under the administration of a mayor, which is not always a bad thing. But here in the last 12 years, it's been a consistent defunding effort of the New Orleans Police Department.
All right. Ronald Surpass, thank you very much. Former police chief, now a professor at Loyola. Good talking to you again.
Nice to see you, Eric.